Welcome to this episode of Taking Notes. I'm Emily, and this episode is about how music has impacted culture. And I am here with Josh.
That's me.
And Ryan.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, back hundreds of years ago, music notation as we know it today, it started as a way of recording Gregorian chants, and they were recorded as neumes, which is not exactly what the piece would have sounded like, but a precursor to modern sheet music. And in my music history class, I've actually been learning a lot about it and how it spread throughout the entire Holy Roman Empire, just to make sure that things stayed the same throughout the entire empire, because through different regions, like, things would change, and the empire was so large that it was very hard to control. And even to this day, in like Catholic churches, each service is the same around the world, no matter the language. I mean, of course, it's translated into that language, but like the same verses are talked about. So in like Catholic Christian culture back then, music was a part of the Catholic Church in actually, being able to control people, because religion was just such a huge part of people's lives, and to an extent for people today, but especially back then. And there were movements like the Reformation with Martin Luther that added instruments into music, because beforehand people would say that having instruments distracted people from the worship of God, but that slowly started to change with Martin Luther, and music became more music and not just worship. I mean, there were secular songs beforehand. I mean, one of the first polyphonic pieces was secular. It's a 6-part piece called Sumerisicumen in. I probably pronounced that wrong. I don't know how to pronounce Middle English.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, it's from 1260. I highly recommend it. It's catchy.
I will do that.
So you mentioned the Gregorian chants, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, they didn't have our note system yet, right? They had a smaller scale system that they were writing with. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was a certain scale. The choir director would actually, I cannot pronounce it, the Gwydian hand. So basically, he would point to whatever part of their hand, and it would be a certain note, but it wasn't like 7 notes in a scale. It was actually different. So, I mean, it doesn't really apply today, but honestly, that the idea of being able to point to one part of your hand and have a choir sing that note, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's very practical.
Yeah.
I like it.
And eventually with like the printing press, that just exploded music. It just exploded new genres, and it actually, exposed people to different types of music. And there probably was a lot less control of people from the Catholic Church because of that. People were using instruments.
Yeah.
This was in the early 1500s that the printing press for music was invented, and so music could be distributed, and people could learn music without being taught by somebody else. Like, they could just look at it and read it, which was a huge revolutionary concept. And so, yeah, a lot of new genres and different instruments they became more popular, and music became even more complex. And that Renaissance time, like, it influenced musicians and evolved into the Baroque and classical, romantic. And romantic has so many interesting chords, like so many key changes. I love it, but it's really hard to sing.
Sure.
Like, try to sing a piece from the Romantic era. Like, I go through my pieces with my voice teacher. She's like, okay, so like it starts in G major, then we're just gonna go into E minor, and then just go into this and go into that. And it's like, okay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the printing press, and I think it's ironic how you're mentioning that the Catholic, well, the religious government at the time was very much in control of the music production. And a big reason the printing press was so pushed for in Germany, I can't remember what century this was, but they pushed for the printing press. One man did because he wanted to print Bibles for everyone to read.
Yeah.
But it kind of ironically allowed music to become secularized in a way. And more people, the concept of the amateur musician or the hobbyist musician came to be because now we can print music and you can own it in your home. You don't have to go to church or to a performance just to hear music. You can hear it in your own home, which is a very cool development.
Yeah, I think it's important too because we were talking a lot about the culture and how music has impacted culture of the society it's been a part of. And before, there was this huge, like we were talking about the printing press and this way to mass produce stories and words. A lot of it was told by mouth or by old folk tales or songs. Anytime you see a movie, like a Middle Ages movie, you'll always see, the town, bard. He's always like singing a song about the great knight, or he's always telling a tale in this form of music, and it's one of the ways that stories were passed down is by word of mouth, by songs and tales and various things like that. So that was one of the big ways to share that. And I think a big part of culture during that time was music, and music definitely impacted the culture that it was in. Because it was a way to share something that you couldn't share another way. I mean, you could experience it firsthand. And now the printing press comes around, and now the culture of music changes because it's no longer a centerpiece of telling a story. Now it's just a way to do it, I guess, if that makes sense. Like it's no longer the only way to hear the music is going to see a performer. Now it's in everyone's home, which I think is super important. Mm-hmm. And it definitely a big change on the culture. So, like, as we're talking about the change in culture of music, I think music totally changed when the printing press came along and changed how everyone was able to experience music, I think, which had a big impact on music's culture because it expanded and then there was room for way more of it everywhere. So I think it's super important, the printing press's evolution.
Yeah, I think that it actually, the idea of the printing press just expanding genres, honestly, it reminds me of the internet and how, having access to the internet has opened up music to so many different, it's exposed people to music they wouldn't otherwise have heard of. Just like a few months ago, a band I like, somebody leaked concert footage from the time when they had their first singer, and that had never come out. And that was, that first singer left in probably like 96. So it's really low quality. It's from like 1993, somebody's personal camera from 1993.
Doesn't get much lower quality than that.
Yeah, we keep getting these new advancements which give us new avenues to turn to. And I think it's really cool that with the internet, we now have access to of music being recorded in modern times, old pieces of music being re-recorded in modern times, but you can also go back and listen to recordings that are 100 years old, or, just look at old sheet music and reproduce it. It's really cool.
And that in itself impacts society and culture because, all the people who are now into vinyl because they can look back at, looking and listening to some music that they would never have found if it wasn't through the internet. Mm-hmm. And then they're like, oh, well, and then they see how retro everything was. Like, man, I want to hear what that sounded like back when you could hear it in the 70s, when that record would come out. So I think the internet having this availability to music that happened, 50 years ago, and you can look back at it, inspires culture today because there are some people who are like, oh, I'm just an old soul. I prefer the 60s and 70s music way better. And that idea of the change in the culture of those people is because the internet allows them to go back and see a culture they were never a part of, but can still want to experience it in their own way. And I think that's super important. And so music still changes society today the same way it did when it first came out. I mean, there's some very historical songs that we were talking about that really inspired the culture when they came out. We were talking a little bit about like the anti-racist racism songs like Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit in 1939, which was one of the first songs to address segregation and racial issues. I believe you were the one that was talking about that, Emily.
Yeah, I mean, this was in 1939. The article that I was reading said that this song was one of the kickstarters for the civil rights movement, like what we see in like the 60s, the segregation and racial issues in that like context, like Jim Crow laws. I mean, obviously that's not the start of the civil rights movement in and of itself. That started way before then. But I think it was Billie Holiday. I think she actually died because a hospital didn't want to take care of her.
Wow. That's awful. I think one of the biggest reasons that Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit was big too is because Billie Holiday, this is the first time we see a Black artist take the front stage in music. You know, this is like a very popular song. It wasn't incredibly popular during the time, but it's one of the few times that we see that it takes front and center, and it finds its way into the radio, and it finds its way into people's homes, and people begin to listen to the lyrics, and it makes them take a step back as to what is really happening. And I think that's important because during the 30s and 40s, I believe this was a time where, you know, jazz musicianship amongst the African American community in America began to explode and find its way into radios and clubs all around the area. And I think that was a big thing too, because a lot of these blues and jazz tracks had a lot of stories of what was happening in the Black community. I think that's super important. And how that impacted the culture was, you know, telling a story. Since no one would listen to it by word of mouth, maybe by music would change how they viewed it.
Yeah, it's cool to see, I guess, you know, different groups, people coming together, you know, oftentimes like jazz, for instance, it's a very Black community oriented. That's where it started in New Orleans and vaudeville jazz. And I think in the beginning, it was this like tug of war between like, is it Black music? Is it white music? Are the white people stealing the Black music? But it sort of just evolved into this Black people. They started this type of music, and then it just was allowed to evolve into what it is. But it's great to remember that it was a very much political statement in some ways. Sometimes it was just about dancing and music, but other times it was a political statement like you're talking about, which is cool.
Yeah. And I was looking through while I was doing research for this, is that a lot of the biggest times that music has impacted society was when it was the driving force behind social change. You know, we talk about African Americans and the social justice movement and all these different eras in history where, you know, women's rights, Black rights, gay rights. And we see that there have been songs during that time that really pushed those. We were talking about Billie Holiday, and then we were talking some of the women's rights. You know, there was this empowerment of we see more women. I want to say like 60s or 70s. The era during the 60s, you know, the whole anti-war hippie movement, you know, when something is beginning to take momentum in society, we typically see that the music represents the movement that's happening. Like we said, with Black rights, women's rights, gay rights, there's typically music that comes out with those movements that really pushes it forward. I think it's very interesting that not only is music driving and changing culture, but it's also a pretty good representation of the view of the changing culture.
So, talking about how music has had such an impact on society, in the 90s, many radio stations have been bought up by huge companies, and, you know, they want to appeal to the lowest common denominator, like just appeal to as many people as possible. And I'm pretty sure this can negatively affect the political nature and the impact of music because, artists are going to be censored because things are controversial. If you look at not just musicians, but celebrities in general, when they do something that's controversial, there's a section of people who are like, oh my goodness, yes, I love you. Keep on doing that. But then there's a section of people who never want to, consume their media ever again. And it divides up the crowd. A lot of record labels will then force artists to not be controversial and will control people. I mean, I know Miley Cyrus, she's changed a lot recently. Her whole thing, and then 2013. And now she's kind of doing more rock. And it fits so well with her voice. Like, she has amazing distortion.
Yeah. I think like you were saying how there's this big change in how music is shared and all that. I think is a culture in itself. The music world with the introduction of monopolization and commodification. Radio stations aren't local. I mean, they're owned by major companies, and the way streaming is. I mean, we've talked about streaming and how awful it is 1,000 times. And I think that creates its own culture of what the companies want you to hear. Like I said, that own common denominator of how do we get it in people's ears so they'll keep coming back for more, but we touch the most amount of people, they'll give us the most amount of money as possible, which I think is a culture in itself. And I think it's very, very important as the effect that's had too, the way that the companies kind of control what you listen to really changes, I think, a lot of people's music tastes, because I think there'd be a much wider variation of musical interests if it wasn't for the precise marketing of music that it is today. And I think that's a huge impact on our culture.
Yeah, I think as we've seen, it just, it's an election year. As we've seen for the past several years, tech companies and these big corporations that run our social media, that run all the things we're consuming every day, definitely look for what they think is culturally popular, what they think is going to basically sell. And I think the same goes for the music, the streaming services, radio companies, podcast companies, anybody like iHeartRadio, Spotify, all these people, they're looking at what's culturally popular and they're taking maybe the music that they think will get the most clicks, get the most viewage or whatever it is. And that's what they're going to hope people are going to listen to by putting it in playlists or playing it on the radio or whatever. And it kind of makes this, and you see it on Twitter and YouTube and whatever else, this one-sided either political or cultural opinion, and it leaves out a lot of maybe the other people that aren't experiencing those same opinions.
Right. And not to get political, but the majority, 99% of music is dominated by the left. The left or the progressives in music, and
right.
And that typically, I mean, name a celebrity who's who has come out in a perhaps. I'm not getting political in any way, shape, or form, but name a celebrity who is very popular in mainstream who has come out and supported Trump. They're all very.
Besides Kanye.
Yeah. And then what happened to Kanye? Yeah. And the man, then he had a mental breakdown, because he's, but the music industry, I think if you look back, 60s, 70s, 80s, and back in those eras, there was music coming out for both sides of the political spectrum. Some were a lot of it was anti-government, which is primarily like an anti-governmental viewpoint, typically leans more to the right on the political spectrum, fight the system, we don't have to bow down to you. And the left is more like, trust our leaders, they'll get it done because we need to trust them. And if you don't trust them, then, then you're no fun. And that's a very, very, very boiled down way to do it. But.
Right, yeah. And also you had kind of the anti-religion going on in conjunction with the Jesus movement. You had John Lennon, but you had this Jesus movement going on at the same exact time where it's like this revival of Christianity, and you have, the world doesn't need religion. You're right. It was more of some would look at it as a more balanced media playing field. But now, like you're saying, and especially in Hollywood, you look at those people, you can't come out as conservative in Hollywood. Otherwise, you get blacklisted. You don't get work anymore. That's just how it is.
Yeah, that's why like musicians have to keep their politics out of their music if they view anything else but what is in the modern cultural acceptance, which is a shame.
Yeah, it sucks sometimes, and just like there's just not enough forgiveness of
Amen.
people. And I am subscribed to this one girl on YouTube, Yeonmi Park. She's actually a North Korean defector, and she's kind of talked about that. And she, it kind of boggles her mind how people are still so tribalistic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And, even people who come from that oppressive background, she was able to see some correlation between that, and just it's interesting getting a perspective from somebody who has a totally different background from you. I don't know. I love that.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting
No,
to me.
that's definitely healthy and good to hear.
When as we're talking about it, and we've talked about both ways of culture, how culture has impacted music and music has impacted culture. I think one of the ways music right now is reflecting culture is with, like we talked about, the only music that is allowed to be mainstream is if it is agreeing with if it is agreeing with the political ideology that is dominating it. So like you're saying, we looked at the 60s, 70s, 80s, like punk music, like early punk music. Let's say that there was bands that really took it to the extreme. I mean, they're like anarchists, like the extreme anti-government as far as you can go. So as a person, I don't agree with it, but I totally would want them to play it. Like it's not something that I agree with, but I think with every ideology, there is some truth to it to an extent. Don't
right.
Take that too far, but I think it needs to be heard. I mean, there's something that they're saying, even though they're maybe having the wrong answer, there still could be a problem in there, and it should be played. But now today, there are people that get attacked for, like a musician. I can't think of one on the top of my head. Kanye. Kanye's a perfect one. Kanye comes out and he is supporting Trump. He's like, I'm going to vote for Trump. And people before that loved Kanye. I mean, Kanye was and still is to this day one of the biggest names in the music industry, either producing or the artist. And the way that music is reflecting the culture is the cancel culture. I mean, Kanye, the way he was like shunned out, some people stopped selling his music. Some people were like, there's like videos of people burning his albums. They're like, oh, we're done. He's voting for Trump. How could he? He came out as Christian. How could he? And that impacts the culture we're living in right now, which is a very cancellation based. If I don't agree with you, you're wrong and a bad person. And I think that reflects the way the music is being interpreted today. Is I'm not going to listen to what they think and what their passions are in music if they can't agree with me, if I don't agree with them on their political level. And it's awful.
It is awful. I think it's such a problem that people have come to the conclusion that it's like, if I don't agree with it, I don't even want to hear it. And I think we as a culture need to get over that. We need to be okay and embrace a new idea, even if it's an idea we've heard and we despise it. I think we need to be okay with hearing it and thinking, why is it that I dislike this so much, and not just saying this should never be played again, this should never be heard, never see the light of day again. It needs to have a place in our conversation, but it needs to have, if you have a counter argument, make it known, but don't just outright cancel it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the biggest like free speech girl ever. Like, I mean, if somebody has a dumb opinion, I have every right to say that it's a dumb opinion.
Yeah.
Like those people, they're going to have a platform no matter what, but it's good to have a platform where it can be challenged. I mean, I think it's very good to be able to be challenged and whatever. I think we're totally off topic, but
yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is and it isn't off topic because freedom of speech. I mean, you have the right to speak, and people have the right to have you not speak, I suppose, if they are louder than you. Which is how it works. I mean, it's kind of how the music industry is. I mean, we see artists or actors or whatever they are, be pushed out of whatever political standing. They're stripped of that. because of it. I'm trying to think other than Kanye. I know there's a lot of artists that come out as Christian, or they come out with their religious beliefs or even their political beliefs, and people are like, I'm never listening to him again. And it's like,
Yeah.
whoa. It's like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. There are probably zero political things that I agree with the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Those guys are nuts. Those guys are nut jobs. I mean, if you've ever heard them speak about some of the things they speak about, I mean, they've performed shows in nothing but socks. I mean, literally just
Right.
wearing socks. There are very few things that I agree with them politically, or probably very few things in general that I agree with them on. But I love their music.
Mhm.
You got to separate the art from the artist, and I think Hollywood and the music industry has been unable to do that for quite a long time, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Duran Gray, another Duran Gray example. I mean, the first song I listened to them was Obscure, and it's a song against abortion. I mean, I'm pro-choice, but that song still slaps. I mean, I love it. When they did their song Venushka, it was kind of anti-government, but I read an interview where the interviewer was talking with the bassist Toshia about it, and just about like censorship against like the popular belief, and like no radio stations would play it. And just to get the point home, right after that interview was done, a representative of their label literally asked the interviewer to cut some things out from what Toshia said.
The unfortunate thing is I'm sure that he doesn't want that to happen, but he knows how it's going to be interpreted by the audience, and he knows it's going to really hurt the band, which is more of a showing of the culture of people's disagreement. They're unable to disagree and still respect the artist. And I feel for him. I mean, obviously, I don't agree with having to have that censored, but you have to look at it from his perspective. I mean, he's in charge of the sales. He's in charge of making sure it goes well. And if that stuff comes out, he knows that even though he might agree with it, he knows that people are not going to be okay with, they're going to stop listening to them. And he's ultimately in charge of the sales. So, I mean, he's got to do it, unfortunately. I mean, I wish it wasn't the way it is, but like we said, that really impacts culture. But
Yeah.
They're a Visual K band. Visual K comes from Extra Pants' old slogan, psychedelic violence, crime of visual shock.
yeah.
Like, how are you going to get any more controversial than that? But like,
Right.
something a little anti-government. Oh no, let's censor that. Oh, a lady eating a baby's head. Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, and then WAP comes on the radio, and we're like, yes, this is great. This is what we need. We need a song that we have to cover our children's ears. If we hear the first line of that song, our children have already skipped, 5th through 12th grade of sex ed.
Oh my goodness, I saw a TikTok where this little kid was asking this mom,
I know
what
exactly
about
what
that
you're talking
song about the holes in the house?
Why don't they fix the holes in the house? The holes, yeah, there's holes in this house. And the mom is just like, oh no.
Well, yeah, on that note, in closing, I think something I like to challenge myself with, and I think everyone should do here and there, is just, whatever genre of music you're into, whatever at that moment, just think about like the complete opposite spectrum and listen to some songs in that genre, whether it's lyrically or style-wise, and try to find like one thing you like about it, or just find something to appreciate about it. I think that's a cool way to just get to know another type of music you would never have listened to before.
Both with music and political, or
Absolutely.
it's just a good way.
Anything in life. Yeah, anything.
Always be well versed. Always be well versed. I think it's a great way to wrap up the topic today.
Many social movements have been impacted by music, and the commodification of music has slowed down its influence, but not all the way. Thank you so much for joining us on Taking Notes. I've been your host, Emily, along with Josh and Ryan. Have a great day, and we hope to see you next time. Bye!
Later.
Bye.